Okay, this is a debate about principles. The principle of freedom and the principle of equality. It is not about which principle is better. The proposition do not have to prove to you that freedom is good, or indeed that it is bad, or even that equality is good or bad, as the case may be. It is also not about the inherent incompatibility of these principles, because there are almost certainly situations in which a measure of freedom can coexist with a measure of equality. It will also not be enough for the opposition to argue that a lack of freedom precludes equality too, because in that case, all that means is that equality is always hard or almost impossible to attain. Simply put, the proposition must prove to you today that total freedom cannot provide equality, and that the closer to total freedom we come, the harder it is to experience full or even a measure of equality. And then the opposition, in order to win, must disprove this. So, firstly, some definitions. Firstly, what is freedom? So, to be free is to have the ability to act within the world as an actor without interference, and to assess a situation on our own terms as an actor with agency without being interfered with. And then what interferes with our specific capacity to make decisions? There are two things. Firstly, there are obvious structures. Things such as things just as simply as physical things like this table in the way of me prevents me from walking in a straight line forward without climbing on top of it. Or things such as political systems. So I am prevented under our current system of government from going out into the street and shooting someone, which is probably a good thing. But it does mean that my freedom to act in this specific way is constrained by the system under which I live. And then secondly, there are invisible structures, or things that even if they are not physical elements, are hard to see. So these take the form of things such as norms. So insofar as from the moment that I am raised, socialized within a society that holds specific things as values and dislikes other specific things, I'm conditioned to live under these norms, the value system by which I operate and by which I assess a situation and make a decision is something that has been conditioned in me and socialized in me since birth, so it is something that interferes with my capacity to make a decision. And then also things such as the lenses through which I see the world, which could be something as simple as my glasses, or things, or a fairly obvious lens like patriarchy, or a lens that is sometimes less hard to notice, such as things just as the concept of myself as a being and of looking through the world as a being with a self. So the key thing here is that total freedom is a lack of any of those systems interfering on my capacity to assess a situation and to make a decision. I think that any kind of system, by virtue of the fact that it is very hard for everyone to buy into those things, creates some form of a group of other in society, but I understand that this is a pretty hard burden for the opposition to prove. I think this motion also stands in worlds in which there is a norm that is fairly easy for us to buy into, insofar as it's a norm that we think murder is bad if it is only enacted for our own gain. So that is what I mean by freedom, and then what I mean by equality is something like equality of opportunity. So I think this is important for the proposition to put forward, because there are always factors such as luck, or even just a fault in our capacity to assess a situation, to make a decision. So things such as luck and things such as mistakes that can prevent me from accessing certain things that I need to survive, such as food or shelter. But it is important that I have the opportunity to do that in the same way that anyone else would. I think that on our side of the house, I think this looks like something which ignores physical capacity. So, for example, I know this I don't know if this is particularly a feminist thing of me to say, but women are physically weaker than men. So in a world in which each individual has to go out and find their own food and shelter, that's a specific disadvantage that half of the population face, but also people who exist who suffer from things like physical disabilities, which could be not to bring it back to this, but it's harder for me to see things, or people who struggle with mobility also face specific struggles in trying to access things they need, such as food or shelter. So equality is specifically when those inequalities in our natural physical capacity are dealt with, so that everybody has the same capacity to access things that they need, such as food or shelter or sustenance and other things. So what does this look like in the world? Specifically, I think there are So if you take it as like the state of nature, for want of a better term, in which there are no structures that we live under, no norms, or as close, like again, to be fair to the opposition side, as close as is possible to having no norms, insofar as human beings are or automatically perform value judgments. So it's very, like, as soon as human beings, sure.
Under this system of no norms and no constraining structures, would it be possible for us to have any conception of freedom? Because surely every conception of freedom will have to be conditioned by our social surroundings.
Okay, well, perfect. I'm going to get on to, like, specifically the kind of roles that I think are like important in this debate. I think that like the world that I want to talk about here is one in which like no norms exist, but I think that's probably not like fair, I guess. I think there are like two specific situations in which this debate is relevant. Firstly is the world in which I suppose humans do, what's the word? Like come together and they do like make collective endeavors and take collective action. I think this looks like things like people building buildings, or people like creating specific systems by which they go and hunt food or find shelter. Sorry. What this does is, by virtue of that collective action and by deciding that like this is a good way of finding shelter, that creates a norm insofar as this is the good way to find shelter. So I think in every single situation in that case, there is always someone who defies that norm. So like even if they, like even if under this society it is decided that this person, say, who finds food in a different way or has a different way of like, different conception of shelter, maybe in the society it's considered that they don't deserve those things, that's still, even if there is a normative value within that, that's still somebody who is not held to the same standard of equality. So even if this is a society that is like theoretically free, insofar as everybody has the theoretical capacity to act in a certain way, that means that they're, well, firstly, they're not actually free, but also that means that equality doesn't exist in that specific world. And then secondly is the world of things like anarchism or anarcho-primitivism, in which everybody, like no collective action occurs, in which people find food and shelter only for themselves, and which people like exist in the world only as like an individual actor. I think that then in this situation, things such as like physical inequalities in terms of like ways of acting, I think stand. So even if this world is totally free, it's not an equal world. So I hope I've proven to you today that freedom is in fact the enemy of equality, and that total freedom precludes total equality. Thank you.
Liberté, égalité, fraternité. Could France have been stupid enough, or if not stupid, let us say unrealistic, utopian, to choose in its national motto two enemy principles? I know that we sometimes show inconsistency when we constantly protest, but have the best healthcare system in the world. Now really, we have this motto since 1790, so a bit of common sense there. What this side of the House defends is that freedom is not the enemy of equality. And here is why. Admittedly, it is not as simple in practice. When a political project tends towards greater equality, it is sometimes criticized for wanting to limit the freedom of individuals. For example, tax redistribution deprives certain categories of a portion of their income and therefore their freedom to spend. We sometimes hear that if we all become really equal, we would all be identical. We would not have the freedom to distinguish ourselves, to be autonomous in the affirmation of our individuality. Certain political regimes have indeed tended to limit the individual liberties in the name of equality of persons. But we often confuse equality and identity. The equality of the members of society does not consist in having the same tastes, the same characteristics, in the similarity of their actions, in the possession of the same goods. Their equality consists in the fact that they have the same chances to reach an end which they freely define. Basically, it's about all having the same freedom of choice. The car, Fordism, by making access to the car more equal between all, has therefore provided more freedom to an undeniable part of the population, do not have housing, are you really free? Freedom can also serve to justify the refusal to participate in collective solidarity. Your freedom stops where others' freedom begin. In reality, there is no freedom in inequality. That is what Rousseau demonstrates in the written letters of the mountain, distinguishing between independence and freedom. When everyone does what one likes, we often do what others do not like, and it's not called a free state. Freedom consists not so much in doing one's will as in not being subjected to that of others. It consists in not submitting the will of others to ours. In other words, to be free is not to do what we want, but to obey a law which we're all equal, all equal. I think that democratic people have a natural taste for freedom. They live it to themselves, they seek it, they love it, they see with sorrow that they're removed from it. But they have a passion for equality, ardent, insatiable, eternal, invincible. They want equality in freedom. And if they cannot get it, they still want equality, even in slavery. We understand now at this stage, that both cannot work without each other. But why then, even when facing these evidences, people still argue against it? I have now to introduce the notion of circles. The mind lives in a vicious circle. We create the problems ourselves, and then we try to solve them. That is what is said by philosopher Svani Prajnanpad. Whatever meaning to a word we assign it, first we must define it. There are many nuances and gradation in the definitions of liberty and equality. We will all agree that these are abstract notions. And in order to debate it, it is imperatively necessary to associate concrete facts with it. And whatever one opposes, socialism and capitalism, we tell ourselves here the extremes, the total absence of balance. This is a fundamental problem. We say it's impossible. We're taught it's impossible, so we will teach it to growing children. They themselves will repeat the cycle, impossible, impossible. Our deepest beliefs must be able to be questioned, even more when they're so Manichaean. Why do you think it's impossible? Because you're relying on situations, examples, countries, where it is people who themselves deeply taught it was impossible to associate freedom and equality. You do not rely on people who have tried and who really understood what it was. You must have questioning. This side of the house has. It acknowledges that in some very concrete, well-defined examples, this motion is fair. Yes, I pay more taxes, I'm less free. But this completely neglects what the notions of freedom and equality deeply represent. Break this vicious circle. Stop this binarity. Equality and freedom, freedom and equality, hand in hand, has, does, and will benefit people. Thank you.
Okay. Before I begin, I would like to invoke my home field advantage and tell any of my students who may be in attendance that you do have to laugh at my jokes. Good. Okay. So it's probably fair to say that most philosophers agree that there's a tension between freedom and equality. But that's about all philosophers agree on when it comes to the relationship between these two concepts. So they disagree as to how much tension there really is. So are we talking about the kind of tension that you might have between two rival armies poised for war, or is it more like the kind of tension between two flatmates where one of them hasn't done the dishes, even though you've been making passive-aggressive remarks about it for 2 days, just off the top of my head? So is it a serious tension or is it not, right? Can we resolve this? Is it possible to hold a philosophical intervention and reconcile these seemingly irreconcilable values? right? Or are they so fundamentally opposed, freedom and equality, that they are forever destined to be in opposition to one another? Freedom, equality, Batman and the Joker, Holmes and Moriarty, Rooney and Vardy. Good, all right. So you might think that the answer to this question depends on how exactly we define freedom and how exactly we define equality. We've already seen from our first speaker that there's different ways you can define this, and it's really important to define these concepts, right? So, for instance, philosophers who talk about freedom might distinguish between negative liberty or negative freedom and positive freedom. So negative liberty or negative freedom being freedom from interference from other agents stopping you to do what you want to do. But there's also a sense in which freedom might be understood in terms of positive freedom, which is the freedom to be who you want to be, to do what you want to do, right? So there's different ways we could understand this concept. And similarly, philosophers who are egalitarians, who want to promote equality, have different ways of understanding what kind of equality actually matters. So what is the currency of egalitarian justice is the question here. Do we want to give people equal shares of resources? Do we want to make people equally happy? Is there some other measure? Do we want to satisfy people's preferences equally? Do we want equality of opportunity, for instance, right? So there's lots of different ways to understand freedom. There's lots of different ways to understand equality. And maybe one way to oppose this motion would be to say, well, look, you might only think that freedom is the enemy of equality, but it turns out once we get the right understanding of freedom, once we get the right understanding of equality, using these two particular conceptions, they can go hand in hand. Maybe, but what I want to argue is that there's a better approach to thinking about the relationship between these two concepts, whichever version of freedom you pick, whichever version of equality you pick. I want to argue that what we should do is retain the idea that there's a fundamental tension between these two values, but actually consider this to be a good thing, not a bad thing, right? Because sometimes tension exists in the context of a rivalry, and sometimes rivals motivate each other to achieve great things. So even if the tension between freedom and equality isn't necessary, sort of conceptually speaking, I'm going to suggest that it's still worth holding on to. What I want to argue for today is that freedom is the frenemy of equality. Okay? So to argue for this, I want to advance two key claims. First of all, that this tension between freedom and equality is a real thing. It's really there. And secondly, that this is a good thing because it allows each value to sort of keep the other in check. Okay. So why think that there's a tension between these two concepts? The traditional answer to this introduces a third character to the scene. And unfortunately, it's not fraternity, it's property. Right? So the thought is, if people are to be entirely free, they must have the freedom to acquire, use, and dispose of their property as they see fit. But this kind of freedom, if it's left unchecked, will inevitably generate all sorts of inequalities over time, right? Property and the power that comes along with it will concentrate in the hands of a small number of very powerful people, and this is only exacerbated over time with the transfer of wealth and property and so on from generation to generation. So according to kind of the traditional view, the only way to sort of fully reconcile freedom with equality in this sense would be to sort of get rid of this notion of property that we have. I'm going to assume for the sake of argument that it's not feasible, at least in the present, to sort of abolish property ownership. So this suggests that you can't have maximum freedom and maximum equality. So now maybe you're thinking, well, why do we need maximum freedom and maximum equality? And that's a good question. We don't, right? Because what I want to suggest to you is that freedom and equality are like food and water. They're both really, really important things. We need both of them to survive, but it would be disastrous to try to just maximize one of these things at the expense of the other, right? We need food and water, we need freedom and equality. We need both of these things working maybe together, but maybe in opposition to each other. So this brings me to my second claim, right, which is that the tension between freedom and equality is actually a good thing. So to see this, think about cases where we go too far in one direction or the other, right? So one easy example is to think of cases where free markets are left unchecked and the kinds of inequalities that this can generate. And it seems like one of the easiest ways to object to unfettered free markets is by pointing to the inequalities that arise as a result. So you're using the value of equality to set the boundaries for how you're going to promote freedom. And it works the other way as well, right? So it's slightly harder to think of examples because we tend to, I think, in the real world prioritize freedom more than equality. But one fun example that philosophers use sometimes is the fact that children whose parents read bedtime stories to them tend to do better in school. And so this leads to a kind of advantage that these children have over others because they're lucky enough to have parents who are willing and able to read bedtime stories to them. And we want to ensure equality of opportunity in education, but we don't want to do it in a way that sort of prohibits or restricts the freedom of parents to read bedtime stories to their children, right? We find other ways of doing it, we find other policies. And the sort of tool that we can use there in explaining why this would be a bad policy and why we should try to find other policies is by saying, well, it involves unacceptable costs to our freedom. we should find other ways to promote the kind of equality we're after, rather than forcing parents not to read bedtime stories to their children, or hiring agents of the state to come in and read bedtime stories. So, in other words, thinking about equality is the best way to set the boundaries, I want to suggest, when pursuing policies that aim to promote freedom, and thinking about freedom is the best way to set the boundaries when pursuing policies that aim to promote equality. So it's not my task to explain to you exactly how we strike this balance. I just want to suggest that keeping these values in tension with each other gives us the best tools to use to explain what has gone wrong if our policies go too far in one direction or the other. And so the last point I'll make then is, well, what about the alternative approach, right? The conciliatory approach, the approach that tries to reconcile freedom and equality. I want to suggest that this risks being sort of superficially satisfying, but ultimately illusory. So the analogy I have in mind here is, think of your favorite reunion episode of a reality TV show, but instead of freedom and equality hugging it out on the couch, or rather, it is freedom and equality hugging out on the couch instead of RuPaul's Drag Queens or The Real Housewives or something, right? So in each case, what you've got here is really just this momentarily cathartic scene that's ultimately contrived by capitalists to make observers feel good about themselves, right? I think that's maybe what we risk doing with this conciliatory approach, right? So in the context of political activism, my worry is that if we try to reconcile the values of freedom and equality, we will be less likely to notice when we get the balance wrong between the two. And given that we're almost certainly getting the balance wrong at present, a conciliatory approach, so trying to reconcile these two values, risks slipping into an acceptance of the status quo or something close enough to it. It's easier to believe that there is no tension between freedom and equality. It's easier to believe that freedom is not the enemy of equality, but we should always be wary of the easier view when it comes to these difficult questions in political philosophy. However, insisting that the tension between these things is real and refusing to diffuse it offers us the best chance of challenging the status quo. By promoting one value, we can constrain the other, and by promoting both, we find the right balance between each. So freedom is the frenemy of equality, and that's a good thing. Thank you.
I should now like to call upon Professor Blair to oppose the motion.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, learned members of this House, both opponents and proponents. To some degree, I find myself in agreement with the person I am not supposed to agree with, but I will only remind you, our previous speaker, that my job was paid for by good King George a few years before the foundation of this society, and King George III was known for his madness, and so I might proceed in that spirit and try to argue my case. I'll do so with brief reference to one old figure, and this is Pericles, in Thucydides' histories and his speech, which is the foundation of Western democracy, on the one hand, and on the other hand, a modern French philosopher with an appeal to those three terms, Jacques Rancière, who's known as one of the fathers of, or the foundational thinkers of what is sometimes known as radical democracy. So Thucydides, defining through the mouth of Pericles what is democracy, will indeed name it as such, demokratia, the rule of the people. And he says, it is because administration is in the hands not of the few, but of the many. And he briefly adds that all men are equal with regard to the law for the settlement of their private disputes, but with regard to the value set upon their opinions, they are not equal, they are judged by their merit. And he concludes, the speech is longer, in fact, than what I'm paraphrasing or quoting to you. He says, and not only in our public life are we liberal, but also as regards our freedom from suspicion, And freedom of from suspicion is perhaps the most radical of all freedoms because it precedes any other freedom that we might envisage. So, as regards freedom from suspicion of one another in the pursuit of our daily life. And herein, in this simple sentence, lies the acknowledged contradiction, if you will, between equality and freedom, which is the subject of our debate, and which my learned fellow debaters have waxed eloquent. It is indeed a contradiction. Jacques Rancière, who speaks about this speech in one of his more famous books, which I urge you to read, called On the Shores of Politics, says, quote, it's a very brief quote, "This speech immediately proposes a concept of freedom, which treats it as the unity of two ideas, a particular idea of the public and a particular idea of the private. But," Rancière adds, "the concept of freedom unifies the private and the public, but it unifies them in their very separateness." And this, to my unfortunate bad luck in this debate, I tend to perhaps agree with our former speakers. The democratic political subject, says Rancière, has a shared domain in the very separateness of a way of life characterized by two great features, the absence of constraints and the absence of suspicion. And what Rancière is doing, to paraphrase, is he's noting precisely the distinction, the incompatibility of these two principles, and at the same time he's saying these two principles must be united. Now, the union of these two opposite and incompatible principles clearly creates some practical problems. It created practical problems already in 5th century Athens and already for Thucydides. And here's what Thucydides says, and this is really my conclusion to you, and it's as applicable today as it was in 5th century Athens. Now, I'm most certainly not saying to you that we today live our lives in the same way that the ancient Greeks did. Quite the contrary, there are significant differences, and if there weren't significant differences, there would be no history. If it was all just the same mush, there would be no history at all. Thucydides, says Rancière, was well aware that the freedom of politics was indivisible from that of whether democracies were governable. That's to say, if the contradiction is there, then clearly democracy is very difficult to govern. Holding these two opposite principles together makes ordinary life in democracy very difficult indeed. But, says Rancière, Thucydides also knew that this question is invariably already settled, that democracies are always both governed and ungovernable. Indeed, governed, this is the key principle which I propose to you, that unites freedom and equality in their very contradictory separateness. Indeed, democracies are governed in as much as they are ungovernable. Politics, the art and science of politics, exists because there is democracy. But that democracy, I put to this House and to you, members of this society, is precisely the fundamental principle that democracies and democracies that operate within the framework of both equality on the one hand and freedom on the other are governed precisely because they are ungovernable. governable. Thank you very much.
I shall now call on swearing up to propose the motion. You have the right, as a native speaker, not to receive sensitive information. Would you like to keep his neighbor's rights? Or
No, I won't. I 100% agree with this proposition that freedom is the enemy of equality. You'll come to realize by the end of my speech that it's the countries that love freedom and hold it up to the highest who nourish inequality, and it's the countries with the most repressive regimes who are at the forefront of the fight for equality in my grandparents' and my parents' life. When my mother was born in apartheid South Africa in the 1970s, she wasn't born an automatic citizen and never gained citizenship until 1994. She wasn't considered good enough for citizenship by the regime of that time. She wasn't even considered human by the regime, by the government. The same government considered most of native South Africans not human, subhuman. She was told she was born inherently unqualified for the title of human and the title of South African citizenship. My late father had no problem with this. He was born in South Africa. His parents were from a foreign country, a very foreign country, you may have heard of it, called Kerry. He grew up with immense benefit from inequality, financially, educationally. He was college educated. My mother was barred from entering any university. He grew up with immense social inequality. He had many, not many servants, but inherently he did, just through the regime. And no one ever told him that he was inherently insufficient to become a citizen of South Africa. But he was contrastly told he was superior to many people in the world. He was told he was superior to people in Latin America, in India, in Australia, and of course Africa itself. It was the countries who hold democracy at their highest values and who hold the transparency to avoid corruption in its absolute and the goodwill towards men as a solid virtue in their country, which upheld the regime in South Africa. It was countries which applied freedom, and not just in ideals, but in action, which upheld the regime. Countries like United States of America, Britain, Canada, France, Belgium, Australia, and Israel, unfortunately, were the highest upholders of the regime. But it was the countries with some of the worst records of human rights and repression of many freedoms that we take for granted today that were at the forefront for equality in South Africa. It was the countries like Cuba, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the Provisional Irish Republican Army, the USSR, and ZANU-PF led by Robert Mugabe, and the apparently evil, tyrannical, oppressive terrorist organization, the in Irish law, the Provisional Irish Republican Army, was one of the few organizations in the world which showed love to the defenseless and weaponless native South Africans. They had a great, infamous reputation in this country of not upholding freedom within their communities. But their great act of kindness inside South Africa led and paved the way to freedom, eventually. Led the way to pay for equality in the country. They were the only foreign organization to be hurt more than their help. They ended up losing 150 Irishmen in South Africa because of their help. The second organization, the very oppressive USSR, and you may have heard they really lack freedom in that former country. They were the top supporters of equality within South Africa. They funded the ANC, they gave them military training, logistics training, and they funded many international organizations which led and paved the way to equality
within South Africa and to oppose the apartheid regime within the countries such as the United States and Britain and the Republic of Ireland by Sinn Féin. The authoritarian ZANU-PF, led by the world-famous Robert Mugabe, was an organization that has a high infamous reputation of a lack of freedom within their countries. It created many, many genocidal attacks on its own people, but it was at the forefront of the fight for equality within South Africa. They protected many, many South Africans during their time when Robert Mugabe was alive and during the time of need for the ANC. And the Palestinian Liberation Organization is famous for many reasons, and one of those many reasons is in freedom. But in their time of need, after the 1973 Yom Kippur War, they were destroyed. They had very few financial funds and very few men to fight in their own liberation struggle. But they offered South Africa financial assistance to fight in their campaign of equality, even though they had nothing and very, very little in their lives. They gave their time to ensure equality would happen in South Africa, and eventually it did. And unfortunately, the PLO has not succeeded in their aim for equality in their own country, but they did help South Africa achieve equality within their own state, even though they lack freedom in this world. And finally, the repressive Cuban regime, led by Fidel Castro, was the #1 supporter of the equality movement in South Africa. At their highest, they brought 350,000 men to protect and give the gift of equality to all Southern Africans. They fought the apartheid regime for 10 years. The people in their own country had very little freedom, but they were all coming down to a little place called Angola and Namibia to fight the apartheid regime to bring equality in South Africa, and they did succeed in 1988, knocking the apartheid regime out so hard that it fell out of existence. And it did one great thing. It knocked the British out of South Africa, something that hasn't happened here so far. And you may wonder if these oppressive regimes did so much good in leading freedom frontiers. I think they did a lot of good. Cuba knocked out the British, and that's good enough for me. But they definitely don't have a lot of freedom in their own countries, but they are definitely at the forefront of the fight for equality. So I believe that freedom is the enemy of equality.
Firstly, thank you for the invitation to speak to you all tonight. The last time I was in this room was to do a jurisprudence exam, and this feels like an exam all over again. Freedom is not the enemy of equality. Freedom and equality have to go hand in hand for everyone to have a chance to fulfill their lives. I'll give you the example of The Purge, the horror film, the dystopian horror, where for one night every year you can kill whoever you want. That's total freedom. You can kill anyone. But it also means anyone can kill you, because they don't look at equality. They don't look at people having that right to live. You're not important to anyone. So following on from that, I'm going to give you a couple of real-life examples of where freedom and equality work hand in hand together. First of all, in my area of electoral law, gender quotas. It was very controversial when it first came in, because people who had worked for years within political parties had felt that their right to stand as a candidate for a particular political party had been removed. And even the court said, nobody is interfering with your freedom to run as a candidate. But in order for everyone to be equal, in order for there to be proper participation and representation, that freedom had to be tempered with equality. So if you wanted to run, you could run yourself. There was nobody stopping you. But it did mean that if you wanted funding, if you wanted equality, that there had to be a balance. The next example I will give you is from the Constitution itself. We do have a right to equality in the Constitution, but even that right is tempered, because what if you're a woman who wants to go on maternity leave and a man turns around and says, well, I want the maternity leave too? And then you end up with the whole problem of it all being restricted. What if you were that person who has dyslexia, who needs to get extra assistance in order to have the same attainment as anyone else? They get 10 minutes extra, they get a scribe. That's equality, but if it was total freedom, it would mean all those people would be disadvantaged. The next example I will give you is the 8th Amendment, which was removed from the Constitution. Total freedom would mean that that men who wanted reproductive health issues had no questions asked about whether they're pregnant or not. Whereas women, if they were pregnant and they wanted specific health care, we're coming up to the anniversary of the death of Savita Halappanavar, she wasn't considered equal. So by having total freedom and then saying then that freedom would be the enemy of equality, it helps people in life. Another example, Brexit, which the latest update at the moment is there is not going to be any deal. So apologies to anyone who's hoping for one. But in Brexit, you have people who want the total freedom to do whatever they want. You have the normal commentators on the Daily Mail, sidebar of shame comment section, saying that they want to stop the free movement of people posting from Spain. Do they not realise the inherent contradiction in where they want to be? The North, the reason why there will never be a Brexit deal that will ever get any support, is because one sector of society in the UK that has specific concerns, which were represented in the Good Friday Agreement, are not being given equality, they are not being listened to, and that is the massive problem that is going to happen there. So, my speech is going to be fairly short, but there's going to be one major issue in this, and it's already come up before the courts, and it's just such an Irish solution to an Irish problem. Portmarnock Golf Club. It wanted to be the bastion of the freedom of male golfers to play golf free of women. They went through the Equality Committee because obviously there were women who did not like this. And the best Irish solution to an Irish problem, guys, you can have your freedom to have women-free golf, but because you've no equality, you'll get no drink because they took away their bar licence. So that in itself shows that freedom and equality are not enemies. They have to work together because freedom is subjective. My freedom, what I want to be free to do, could harm someone else or could infringe someone else's freedoms. Imagine if I lit up a cigarette right here, right now. That would be me exercising total freedom. But the asthmatics in the room will be calling ambulances for them. And because you have to recognise everyone's issues through equality, it means they have to work hand in hand because equality is objective. It is something that you could measure. Freedom isn't. And by having a balance between the two, you can have freedom and equality working together for a better society. And that's probably the shortest speech ever given by a guest at the Hist.
Now let the call upon Egalitarian to propose the motion.
Ladies and gentlemen, man is born free and yet he is everywhere in chains. We're here tonight to discuss two important principles, perhaps the most foundational principles of our humanity, freedom and equality. We're here to answer a few questions as well. Are they important? Do they clash? These are questions which have grappled in the minds of the world's greatest thinkers, past and present, from Aristotle to Rousseau to Jack Sinnott. People just can't figure it out. But listen, the wait isn't over. No more should you want to answer these questions, because tonight, on this mild Wednesday night in the glorified undergraduate debating society, we will answer these questions once and for all. Who is ready? Panel, ladies and gentlemen, I'm here on this side of the house because I'm a terrible pessimist. I hate all of you, or more accurately, I don't trust a single one of you. Because I believe that humans, while they are quite incredible, they have an incredible capacity to reason, they have an incredible ability to provide empathy, they show incredible ingenuity. I believe above all else, humans are incredibly selfish. I think there's simple reasons for this. I think because humans, as beings, as sentient beings, can only understand their own experience. As much as we believe in equality, as much as we believe in compassion, we also have to understand that the only experiences, the only joy, the only understandings which we will ever be able to get is that of our own understandings, that of our own experience. I think it is human nature to be selfish, to maximize your own experience, because that is the only thing you will ever be able to understand. That is inherent in what experience is and what you can understand. Maybe you're sitting there thinking, listen, that might be true for some people, but that's not me. I'm so great and I'm so ethical, I'm totally not selfish. I'll say two things. First of all, fair play. Maybe you're a saint or maybe you're a psychic who can actually understand the experience of others. But second of all, I think you're probably a liar. Because look at this world. The world is burning. We're doing almost nothing to change that in terms of collective action. There is war, there's famine, and there is poverty in this world of prosperity, in this world of hope, and yet we allow it to happen. Even if there are some good eggs amongst us, the ones with the power, the ones with the ability to change things, they are the ones perpetuating the system, a system where there is inequality rife within this world. I think that is because humans are inherently selfish. I think everyone in this room, we enjoy freedom. That's the freedom which allowed us to come here through our top-up leap cards, to study here with our education, to pay for the clothes off our back. And now that could have been used, that money could have been used to buy malaria nets in Gambia. This time that we're spending here tonight could have been used to protest outside Leinster House. But no, we're inherently selfish and we want the best things for us. Some of us are kind of crazy and think the best way to spend our time is to listen to me ramble on about freedom for 7 minutes. But listen, to each their own. I think what it means is that given that the innate, inalienable selfishness of humankind, I believe what this leads to is that in a situation where freedom is maximized, equality is minimized. I think when Homo economicus is set free, he shall reap what he shall sow. Man will try to better themselves, and the boys will be boys. I think freedom in this world, in a world of selfish men, in a world of selfish people throughout the world, it is the American dream. It is manifest destiny. It's trying to ban women from your golf clubs. It is the ultimate form of self-care where we are reduced to a war of all against all. I think the example given in the last speech of the Purge is probably quite extreme, but quite an apt description of what humans are like. When we do not have these norms and strictures of freedom that Aisling talked about, restricting our ability, I think we do go reduce down to what our base instincts are. I think it does come down to how can we better our own experience, because that is what we'll understand. As much as humans can claim to be empathetic, as much as humans can claim to be compassionate, when we achieve equality at the expense of our own material benefits, at the expense of our own happiness, we will never understand or never experience the gains provided by that. That is why it is the basis human instinct to look out for yourself, to look out for what you care about. I think that is what freedom means in this world. Freedom means maximizing people's choice, maximizing the ability to arrange their affairs however they want. But I think, unfortunately, this means that people will arrange their affairs in such a way that minimizes other people's material ends and will go against the principles of equality. I think what this arrangement of people's choices, what this arrangement of people's affairs means is that it can only be described as antagonistic to equality. I think it's already been explained by people on my side of the house exactly how this arrangement of inequality perpetuates itself. In that when we are in this state of nature, we are in this area without restrictions on our freedom, when we are as free as we possibly can be and can decide to do whatever we want. It is a case of survival of the fittest. Those who accrue capital which self-perpetuates, capital which generates itself. This leads to a timeless cycle of wealth perpetuating wealth, where certain people have more resources than others, and certain people can have power and coerce other people. Ladies and gentlemen, this is by definition inequality. This is mechanistically how freedom leads to greater inequality. And I think the reason this happens is because of our own selfishness. I know that I started the speech with almost a caricature of everyone being Sir Scrooge McDuck, Monty Burns, trying to gain as much as they can. But listen, Just because it's the simple reason that humans want to better themselves. Humans want to do the most that they can because that is what brings us joy. Even at a very small level, when humans are looking out for themselves above all else, this is what leads to this inequality. Because we as humans, we do not live in a vacuum. No man is an island. We think when our actions interact with other people's, and when we try to accrue resources, when we try to get happiness whichever way we can, and that will detract from other people's happiness, I think most times humans will take that choice. Humans will take a choice which benefits themselves because of our innate selfishness. And I think this means that by allowing maximized freedom, we minimize economy. We minimize equality. Because within this freedom, we are complicit in the oppression created by this changing amount of wealth. We think when freedom is used to accrue wealth, which lobby governments to perpetuate inequality, when it's used to ban women golfers from your clubs, when it's used to steal surplus value of labours from your workers because you have the freedom to build up a business which enables you to have power and coercive elements over other people in society. We think that is how freedom leads to inequality. We believe freedom is the enemy of equality because we believe humans are the enemies of each other. We don't think this is necessarily a bad thing in terms of facts. Certain systems can harness this selfishness, harness this innovation to lead to benefits. But we do think it means that it is incompatible with a true understanding of equality. We don't think anyone particularly is guilty of looking after themselves or wanting to be as happy as they can be, because that is all we can understand at a base level. That is all we can do in order to get the most out of our lives. We don't think you're particularly guilty in doing that. We do think when we do not have freedom in order to ensure that resources are redistributed, when you do not have restrictions on freedom which create norms which protect the most vulnerable in society, we think we let this selfishness run free, and we think we lead to inequality. Ladies and gentlemen, maybe I'm just a pessimist, but if you believe there's any selfishness in humanity, if you can look into your own heart and understand that you do want yourself to be happy, and you understand that you do want the best for yourselves, that is why you must propose this motion. Thank you.
He was just flattering me. He's the real great thing. Big love. Sorry, this is a new phone. I'm trying to find the time. It's coming. Okay. What happened to our dream of freedom? Members of the College Historical Society, as we look out on the world today, we see America, a country which claims to be the bastion of freedom and has one of the highest rates of urban poverty in history. We see companies like Facebook and Twitter who promise to liberate us from distance, from the inability to communicate, who have manipulated our lives through the management of our data to the point at which we don't understand ourselves. We look at legal regimes meant to protect our equality, which increasingly limit our freedom to the point that we no longer recognize it. What has happened to the liberal dream of freedom and equality combined? I'm going to tell you two things in this speech. Why the opposition's case is compelling, and then why it's wrong. And what I'm going to do is talk about the definitions of freedom and equality. And it's worked out well for me that this has been heavily contested within the debate, because I'm going to do something that only the last speaker can do, because it kind of ruins it for everyone, and say that there are no definitions of these concepts. Jan tells us that they're abstract and they need to be concretized. But I would go even further and say that it is physically impossible to concretize things like freedom and things like equality. I think they are built fundamentally on sand. I don't think there is a thing that exists somewhere called freedom, or there is a thing that exists somewhere called equality. And if we just keep looking really, really hard, we can find them. I don't think that's how it works. I think instead we constantly use these working definitions that we've essentially stumbled upon. In the West, it is primarily a negative conception of freedom, as we heard from Brian. In Ashling's world that we heard at the beginning of the debate, it is a kind of blank slate idea of freedom. But recognize that in each of these cases, the form of freedom and the form of equality that we're thinking about is conditioned by the very things it's trying to achieve and the framework in which it's situated. The blank slateness of a world that is a blank slate causes us to create a blank slate conception of freedom and a blank slate conception of equality. The liberal capitalist nature of the West causes us to create a liberal capitalist nature of freedom, a liberal capitalist nature of equality. And you can do this in so many different ways, because these concepts are fundamentally like an empty jar that you could fill however you happened to want to. And that's why it's so easy for proposition to stand up here and tell you that freedom and equality are incompatible. Because all they have to do is create a version of freedom and create a version of equality that are incompatible, or that do look like they're in opposition to each other. And then we just buy into it, because essentially, this is all we do anytime we try to define it on any side of the house. You're essentially repainting the Eiffel Tower, and the Parisian skyline looks completely different. The entire social milieu changes as a consequence of the reconstruction of these concepts. And so what I think that means is that essentially these ideas, these concepts of freedom and equality, probably look heavily like they are in opposition in so many different scenarios, in so many different ways. And to an extent, I think that is probably true in the sense that anything can be true. Because once you buy into those conceptions, once you buy into those kind of interpretive assumptions, you will think that freedom is the enemy of equality. But why do I think that a proposition are wrong? Well, I have sort of two ways of going about this. The first is that I think you can just have conceptions of freedom and equality that are constructed in different ways. If you start at a baseline of a society that is perfectly egalitarian, you will construct an egalitarian conception of freedom. If you start at a baseline of a society that is perfectly free, you will construct a free conception of equality. But that's probably not actually how anything works, because as I've already mentioned, these concepts are in themselves constructed. So I don't think we can have a society that is purely egalitarian, or have a society that is purely free. It's always a process of mingling, a process of tying these two concepts together. They've always already slipped in the back door behind the concept you think you're discussing. When you're thinking about freedom, that's informed by your idea of equality. When you're thinking about equality, that's informed by your idea of freedom. And there's no way to escape this process. This process happens at the moment at which we engage in thought. But what I think that does mean is that when we do this, when we try and think about these concepts, we are at least engaging with them in the best way that a human being possibly can. In this moment of founding, when we question our understanding of freedom, when we question our understanding of equality, and are forced to confront the constructed nature, forced to construct the kind of interrelation between these two concepts, I think that's when we are at our most free, and that is probably when we are at our most equal as human beings, when we are the most connected to the entire community in which we operate. I think this is what happens at the moment at which someone decides to start a revolution. I think this is hopefully what happens at the point at which people decide to draw up a constitution. I think this is what happened when Pericles stood to make the funeral oration. I think in these moments of challenging thought, we are as free as we possibly can be, and we are as equal as we possibly can be. And the only way that can be the case is because these two concepts are mingling together, because they are forming and constituting each other at one time. So what does that mean for how society actually looks? Because I think that's probably part of our burden on this debate, and it's probably the part of our burden that we're going to fail at, because it does look different for every single individual. To me, based on my interpretive assumptions, it looks like an anarcho-syndicalist utopia, because that's what I think would be really cool. For Pericles, it looked like a lottery-based system of democracy that existed in Athens. For Americans of a certain persuasion, it probably looks like the horrific liberal capitalism we have right now. But I think that what we can say is that by doing this analysis, by having these processes, we do engage with these concepts, we do bring them together. I don't know if we can create a world that is perfectly free and that is perfectly equal, because I don't think those things exist. But what I do think is that the process of trying, the process of thinking about these things, of questioning their relationships, of noticing the ways in which they're constructed, I think that's a valuable thing to do. I think that's what this debate forces us to do. I think that can only be done at the point at which you bring freedom and equality together and you merge them in ways that are interesting, in ways that are aesthetically exciting, in ways that are politically invigorating. So I think this freedom of thought leads to equality in practice. I think the reason our dream of freedom has failed is because we have become stuck and enslaved to our existing conceptions of equality, our existing constructed conceptions of freedom. I think the point at which we try and break free of those are the points at which we will finally be free and finally be equal. So proud to oppose. Thank you.
you all. I will now put the question to the House. On the motion that this House believes that freedom is the enemy of equality, those in favor?
Aye.
And all those against?
Nay.
Okay, answer here.
We will act by people raising their hands. So could everybody in favor of the motion please raise your hand? Do you want to vote for your inside?
Sure. No.
And those against, please.
The motion is defeated.
Yeah.
Hooray!
Okay, I guess I can say something. I agree with the conclusion of the debate, which is that the motion was defeated. Possibly not for reasons that were already given here. I don't know what the reasons were given, but I guess I will have some additional ones. I can't refrain, I'm sorry, from trying to make certain clarifications. So one thing that struck me during the speech is that most people seem to speak about two quite different things. So on the one hand, a lot of people assume they were talking about the freedom of one individual, right, versus equality, which is obviously not about one individual. And so what they were talking about is maximizing the freedom of that particular individual, right? And sort of some people reach the conclusion that maximizing the freedom of one individual is inimical to equality, which, as Hugh said, is true by definition, and therefore I'm afraid not particularly interesting, right? Obviously, if one individual has a lot of freedom, that's going to, including the freedom to engage on other people, such as the example of having the freedom to kill others, that presumably reduces equal freedom. So that goes without saying, I suppose. I guess what I was thinking that the motion referred to start with is indeed equal freedom being assumed, right? And that being the enemy of equality, and by that I assume was meant what we might call distributive equality or economic equality, or generally equality of condition. So equality of or holding, some people would call it, right? So we're giving people obviously equal freedom, but as much freedom as possible to all relevant individuals would somehow undermine their equality of holdings, right? And that would work in this. I mean, this is of course the argument that is usually put forward by what we might call right-wing people who claim that the free market is incompatible with economic equality, and further claim, of course, that the free market in some way protects equal individual freedom. Now, I want to point out, they of course think in some sense that equality is perfectly compatible, inequality is compatible with equal freedom, and that one of the things they usually want to claim is that having unequal amount of money, for instance, or unequal access to things does not produce equal form of freedom, right? So as the famous saying goes, everyone, rich and poor alike, are free to sleep under the bridges. That is precisely what they want to claim in a sense, is that not having money doesn't reduce your freedom to do certain things, right? I'm perfectly free to fly to the Maldives tonight, on my Irish passport, of course. The fact that I don't have the money to fly to the Maldives tonight doesn't mean I'm no longer free to do so. That's one of the things people would normally want to say. Of course, they're wrong about that, right? I think it's by their own account. I mean, if I do actually try to board the flight, from audience tonight, I will be stopped, right, at the gate if I don't show my ticket, which I will be stopped from purchasing if I don't show a certain or credit card. So it does restrict freedom, even in that very basic sense. Now, I guess the other claim they usually want to make, people who want to say that, say, the free market is somehow incompatible with distributed equality, I guess they would usually want to make the claim that in trying to maintain equality, the state itself would have to interfere with people's freedom to engage in economic exchange. Right? That's often the claim. And they would engage, or they would sort of restrict everybody's freedom equally, but they wouldn't, people wouldn't have as much freedom as they would possibly have under a different system. And so that claim presupposes that laws restrict our freedom. And that's probably something that many people agree with. Well, it's very controversial, actually, it turns out, even under the definition of freedom that the people who make this argument tend to accept, right? They would usually go in the definition of freedom that says you are free as long as you are not prevented from doing things by other people, by the way. It's usually a social kind of freedom that we are talking about here. Right? Now, laws don't actually prevent you from doing things as such, unless they are enforced. Right? And unless they are enforced in certain ways. I mean, if they are enforced preemptively, such as my ability to travel to the Maldives tonight, they will enforce that preemptively, I'm pretty sure. They will let me get there and then bring me back, which would be nice. Then that definitely restricts my negative freedom. But they don't always, right? They're not always enforced in that manner. And in fact, I wanted to tell you an anecdote I know about Robert Nosey, the most prominent, perhaps, some proposer of, well, this motion in a sense, right? He would have agreed with the idea that the free market is the enemy of equality. But Nosey himself apparently went to a conference at one point, and he was being driven around by his guests, and they couldn't find parking. So they were going around in circles and not being able to park, and Nosey spots an empty spot and says, well, why don't we park here? And one of the guests, the host said, well, it's not allowed to park here. It's restricted parking. Says, well, what happens if we do park here? And there's no one to stop us. So obviously we can't, but well, there is a fine. Okay, how much is the fine? Oh, it's £100. This was so Nosey says, so that's how much parking costs here. You are perfectly free to park here. So the point of this anecdote being that I think even people who do sort of propose this motion, so to speak, so are of the view that the free market protects individual freedom, equal individual freedom, and that in turn is incompatible with economic equality, must have in mind a very narrow and perhaps inconsistent concept of freedom. And they can't contain both that the state making certain laws that would interfere with the free market, restricts freedom, but at the same time that lack of money or other forms of constraint akin to threat of
for anthology make this hard.
Right, I should now like to call upon the auditor to announce the Society's forthcoming events.
So firstly, I'd like to thank Dr. Frida for her very fine chair's address, and indeed all of our speakers this evening for what was a very interesting debate. I think we can give them all the collective round of applause for their efforts. A few quick announcements before we go upstairs for post-debate reception. The first one is that our debating competition for new university speakers called Maidens is starting to wind up the first stage of it. So if you want to get involved, still want to get involved, there are ways to do so. Please email the record secretary. These details are online on our website, which is thehist.com. And you can take part in a one-day competition called the Wild Card to get to the final of the entire competition. So you can look that up online or message our record secretary to find out more about that. The second thing I'd like to draw your attention to are the oratory returns that are on your seats that I mentioned at the beginning of the debate. So if you could please fill these out and hand them to Jack when you're leaving the chamber, that would be fantastic. Jack is in the blue shirt over there. Again, these are important as they are what is used to determine how we award money and medals at the end of the year. Thirdly, if you enjoyed tonight's debate, we have a debate every Wednesday evening. So next week's debate is this House would finalise Mars in the slightly comedic as a reading debates tend to be, this tend to be more relaxed. I think that will be held upstairs in the Hist conversation room. So if you want to come out that next week, please do. The final announcement that I have, the final two announcements are in relation to upcoming events. Tea and Toast, which is a social event, is on every Thursday morning from 9:30 until 11:30. I think there will be tea, there will be toast. You can come along and chat to our members of society in a relaxed setting. Lastly, tomorrow evening at 7 o'clock, we will be running debate training. So if you like what the speakers are doing this evening and would like to improve your understanding of rhetoric or logic or deduction or reasoning or whatever have you, you can go to our training session tomorrow evening at 7 o'clock for novices, so if you're new to the entire show. With that said, unless I've forgotten anything, Jack? No, all good, excellent. In that case, I would like to cede the floor back to the chair to adjourn tonight's meeting.
Thank you very much.
There was a political years ago. One of his propositions was to colonize explore more and to settle some infrastructures in case the environment would get
lots of people are actually thinking about it.
Yeah.
It's a bit expensive.
He wasn't a scientist. He was only having an ideal view.
Right. But it was just an imperial colony.
And everyone on the live stream from that.